Melissa, and you are live with Fiveable. We are here with part 4 of our Doing the DBQ series, breaking down the different parts of the document-based question for AP World, but also all of the AP histories. So if you've popped in from another subject, that's great. Welcome. Love to have you. Tonight is, like I said, part 4 in our series, and I'm going to be talking about the analysis and reasoning. Let's talk about what's coming up tonight. We are going to run a quick review. What is the DBQ? What are some of the rubric points? And in particular, how do you earn the points for reasoning? And then I want to go over the idea of sourcing. That's really going to take the biggest chunk of our time. Talk about what is sourcing, what are some good tips for sourcing, and then walk you through some practice for sourcing a document. If we've got some time, I would love to also talk about the idea of complexity in a document-based question. This is one of the more challenging skills because it's one of the least concrete. But I want to give it a little bit of time and some thoughts that I try and teach my students in my classroom, and I want to share with you as well. And I put it at the bottom, but really anytime during the stream, I want to say that I'm here to answer questions from you. So if you are in the chat, please feel free to use the chat to ask questions and or make comments, right? Any kind of feedback in the chat gives me the opportunity to tailor what I'm saying to what you need or what you're interested in. You can also use our Ask a Question button if you want to make it a more formal sort of a question like that. But I think we're going to have a small enough crowd tonight that just asking questions in the chat is going to be a great way to get specific feedback on what you're looking for. And I'm happy to answer those as we go rather than waiting for any one particular moment in our stream. All right, let's dive in. So quick recap. What is the DBQ, the document-based question? Oh my gosh, my slide still says LEQ. Crazy. The document-based question, the DBQ, sorry for the typo there, is your chance to show your knowledge and your skills in your own words. So this is one of the free response components on the AP exam. Kind of broadly speaking, you're developing and supporting an argument, which is College Board code for writing an essay, about a topic relating to a prompt. And the thing that makes the document-based question, I think, a little more challenging than just the long essay is that you are also demonstrating skills in understanding sources and making connections between those sources. So this is a more complex task that you're being asked to do. On the AP exam, just some details about it. You'll have about 60 minutes total for the whole DBQ process. And that includes analyzing the documents, planning your writing, and actually writing the essay. Right now in November, 60 minutes seems like it's not nearly enough time for a lot of folks to get through this process. And if you're in that boat, I want to encourage you not to worry. The key with the DBQ is just practice, and you get faster and faster every time you practice. And even if it's practicing with a shortened version in class with your teacher or a full-length version that you're working with either in class or from a practice book, all of those are great ways to improve your speed. The document-based question will have 7 documents to analyze and incorporate into your argument, at least one of which will be a visual. So there'll be an image of some kind, as well as some text documents to analyze. There'll be 7 documents. Recently, the College Board has said that the DBQ is going to be from the period 1450 to present. The DBQ we're going to work with tonight is actually from earlier than that, because this is a DBQ that I compiled using a few different sources. I did not write it from scratch, but I did compile it from some different sources so that we're not using anything copyrighted and breaking any rules or making things difficult for teachers out there who might be planning to assign a particular DBQ to their students. So I'm going to drop the link to the DBQ that I'm going to be referencing today here in the chat. Hang on. Trying to type and talk at the same time. All right, so there's the link in the chat for the DBQ that I'm going to be referencing. If you want to download it and take a look at it, you definitely can. Like I said, this one's from an earlier time period because when I started working on it, that's where a lot of students were at. Now I know a lot of classes have moved on into that 1450 to 1750 time period, but this will be a good thing for us to work with tonight for some samples. And then people always ask, how much is this worth on the AP exams? Worth 25% of the AP exams. So this is definitely a task on the exam that you want to put some effort and some energy into. I also love the DBQ because the skills are all really, with the exception of complexity, all of the skills in the DBQ are really concrete and measurable, which means they're also really improvable. So you can get better and better and better at each of the components of the DBQ to make your overall score more successful. So speaking of that rubric and those points, let's take a look at the points we're going to be focusing on tonight. So the DBQ rubric is broken into 4 categories. Thesis and contextualization are one category. Evidence from the documents is its own category on the rubric. Evidence beyond the documents is a separate category on the rubric. And tonight, our focus is on part 4, analysis and reasoning. And you can earn either 0, 1, or 2 points on analysis and reasoning. But the points are earned separately from each other. So, so each of the points that I'm going to talk about right here is independent. You don't have to do one in order to do the other. Excuse me. Although if you do the first one, it sets you up in a better situation for the second point, I think. So one of the points is what the College Board refers to as sourcing, which the specific language in the rubric is that you must explain how and why a document's point of view, purpose, historical situation, or audience, and I will break all those down in just a minute, is relevant to an argument for at least 3 of the documents. So we're going to break down all of what that means in just a minute. But the idea is that for 3 or more of the documents, you need to go beyond just what the document says to thinking about what the document is and how that impacts what the document says or impacts our understanding as historians in terms of using that document. The key thing to know about this sourcing point is that you must explain that rather than simply describing it. So it's more, there's a what component as well as a how and a why, and you've got to have all of it in order to earn that point. So it's a fairly complex point, but it's definitely doable, and we'll talk through how to do that. The second component of analysis and reasoning is to demonstrate a complex understanding. So rubric language says, demonstrates a complex understanding of the historical development that is the focus of the prompt, using evidence to, and here are some of the keywords, corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument that addresses the question. You notice I've got my magical unicorn here on screen. I call this complexity the unicorn point. And this is how I say it to my students, that unicorns are magical and wonderful. And if you ever encounter one, your life will be changed forever. If you never encounter one, you can still have a full and meaningful life. And that's kind of how I feel about this complexity point. I think that it's something we should all strive for, but it is probably the most nebulous point on the rubric. It's the hardest to teach students, especially if you're in the situation where you're taking your first AP history class, whether it's AP World or Euro or US, whichever you're in. This skill is on the rubric for all of those classes, and it's really difficult to say, yes, that's complexity, because it has to be throughout the essay as a whole. We can't just point to one sentence the way we can with a lot of the other skills. I'm going to break it down for you in a few minutes as to what I think you can and should do in terms of complexity. But I also want you to know that this is the point that if you're feeling really stressed about the DBQ, just pause, put that one off to the side, try it again, maybe a little later in the spring. Eric, who's one of our teachers at Fiveable, has popped in the chat. Those of you who can't see the chat, I just want to reiterate what he is saying right there. He said he read the DBQ at the AP Reading 2 years ago, and he read over 700 essays, DBQ essays at the reading, and he saw a total of 6 with the complexity point. So this is a really challenging thing to do. It is not impossible, and we want to encourage you toward it as much as you can, but don't stress it. Don't freak out about it. Okay, so let's spend the bulk of our time with sourcing. I see we've got a few more people online, so I just want to reiterate and encourage you at any point, please use the chat to ask questions, make comments. Any kind of contributions you put in the chat gives me something to respond to so that I can make this stream exactly what you are looking for and what you need. You showed up live, so you get the benefit of that. People in the replay, let's hope that you've got some good folks in the chat for you tonight. All right, sourcing. Here it is. Let's just start with definition. What is sourcing? So I'll reiterate College Board language from the rubric. It says specifically, for at least 3 documents, the essay explains how or why the document's point of view, purpose, historical situation, and/or audience is relevant to an argument. So this is both an identify and an explain task. And what you're basically doing is for 3 documents, you want to find a key characteristic of that document and then explain why that characteristic matters in relation to the argument that you are trying to make. It sounds like a lot. So let's break down these different categories. One thing I want to say, and I really can't stress this enough because it confuses students sometimes, is that in terms of sourcing, you only need to do one of the 4 categories of sourcing for any given document. You do not have to do all 4. Your teacher's probably going to ask you to try all 4, which is a good skill to do, and you should always do what your teacher is asking you in class. But when it comes to the actual exam, you don't have to do all 4 of these. You could do the same one for 3 different documents and be equally successful. So let's break them down. Point of view. A lot of times when I am talking to younger students, people get a little confused about point of view because in English class and in literature, when we talk about point of view, we often are thinking about, is it in first person narrative form? Is it third person omniscient? Point of view doesn't mean quite the same thing in historical writing. So the question we want to ask ourselves when we're thinking about point of view is, who created the document? What do we know about that person? Some categories that might influence a person's point of view would be gender, right? It's entirely possible at different historical moments that men and women might see a particular situation in history differently, or that they would create different documents. Social class, status within society could be really relevant. People of a higher social status are going to see the world differently than people of a lower social status because their experiences are really different. Relationship to the prompt. A person with a close connection to the topic that you're being asked about may have a very different idea than a person commenting on it from a more removed situation. Special knowledge or limitations. Those are the 2 I really like to think about with point of view is, does this person have special knowledge that lends their words greater credibility? Or what limitations does this person have that might make me question some of what they have to say about a particular topic? So those are questions that we're going to ask ourselves about a particular document. And I'm going to walk you through a sample of this in just a minute. Our second category for sourcing is purpose. So point of view is about who, purpose is about why. Everything exists for a reason. Every document was created for a purpose, and we want to think about what that purpose is. A lot of times the College Board is going to give us some background information about a document that might tell us about the purpose. Sometimes we can see the purpose in the document itself because the author states his or her purpose, which is great. Sometimes we have to infer purpose, and that can be a little bit challenging. But if we can think about why a document was created, it might affect what the document has to say. right? A document that's created to persuade is going to sound really different from a document created to inform, for example. Our third category is historical situation. And this is like contextualization. If you tuned into our stream last week about contextualization for the DBQ, you know that contextualization is about connecting a broader development or process to the specific topic of the prompt. For sourcing, we can do that on a kind of a mini micro level with a particular document. We can think about when and where was the document created, and what do I know about that place and time that could impact what a document has to say, right? A document created on July 4th, 1776 is going to, in the, British colonies of North America is, it could be the Declaration of Independence, or it could be another document, but right, we know maybe something about the political tensions between colonists and the British at that time. A document created July 4th, 1976 is perhaps going to have a really different flavor to it because it's not being created in the context of British American political tensions. It's being created in a whole different political context in the United States of America in a totally different century. So a historical situation could influence what a document has to say or how it gets created. And then our last category for sourcing is the intended audience. For whom was the document created? So if point of view is about the author or creator, audience is about the recipient. For whom was this document created? What does that audience know or not know, right? The audience may have knowledge, which means that the author doesn't have to explain everything, or the audience might be limited in a particular way that requires greater explanation or persuasion. The audience might have specific concerns or interests that an author is responding to. All of these things can influence how a document gets created. And you can choose any of these to discuss for your sourcing. The one thing that I would strongly recommend that you don't do is to use the phrase, this document or this author is biased. My reasoning for this is kind of twofold. Number one, it's lazy. It's lazy analysis because a lot of times, far too often, students who start a sourcing analysis with this document is biased because often then don't go on to explain how that bias affects the document itself, right? We use bias as a shorthand for unreliable. And a document might be unreliable, but we need to know that you understand why that document is unreliable. The second reason I think that saying that the document is biased isn't really helpful is that all of the documents you receive are going to be biased. They all are, because bias really just means that they're created by a human. And all of these documents are generated and created by human beings who have points of view and purposes. They exist in a historical situation, and they're created for an intended audience. So the bias isn't what's most important. It's what factors create that bias or create that limitation or create that credibility. Even like, why do you believe a particular author on a particular topic? And what does that mean for your understanding of what they write in their particular document that they've created? That's what we want to see in terms of sourcing. Not just can you question every document that you see? Great. Yes, question it. And then tell us why we should care. That's what we're really getting at. That's the heart of sourcing. All right, we're getting really close to doing an example. Before we jump into an example, I've got two more quick slides. I just want to blast this one up here really quickly and say that your teacher may be using one of these or a completely different acronym to help you remember sourcing. So if your teacher is not using the terminology of sourcing, but they're using the terminology of HIPP analysis or HAPP analysis or SOAPs or soapstone, I've seen as well. Those are all the same thing, right? I use HIPP with my students, historical context or historical situation, intended audience, point of view. purpose. Sometimes we drop the second P if people are really struggling. The College Board has published a lot of lessons for teachers in the last couple of years using the HAPPY acronym: historical context or historical situation, audience, purpose, point of view, and then the why kind of gets its own little bucket of why does it matter. I like that one as well. SOAPS is a little bit older, but a lot of teachers are still using it, and it's the idea of analyzing the subject. That's the content of a document. And then the rest of that acronym reminds you about sourcing. Occasion, that would be historical context or historical situation, audience, purpose, and then speaker is the second S, which is point of view. Whatever acronym or memory device helps you to think about sourcing is the one that you should use. There isn't one that is superior to all the rest. If your teacher wants you to use a particular model for showing your work in class, do what your teacher is asking. If that model works for you in terms of your memory, keep it up. That's great. If that model doesn't work, be aware that there are a ton of other models out there online, and you should feel free to use any of those to help you think through your sourcing. Okay, couple of quick tips. As you're reading the documents, you want to read both the text or the image of the document and also that little source line at the top. That source information, it has a wealth of knowledge for you when you're trying to do your sourcing. The challenge for a lot of students, though, is that they simply quote that source line rather than analyzing it. So don't just plan never to quote the source line. You can address elements of the source line, but quoting it isn't going to benefit you at all for either this sourcing point or your evidence point. It's not a place that you want to go. Second tip, sometimes your sourcing info is in the source line. Sometimes it's in the body of the document. Both places are places where you can look. So if you're struggling with a source line, look to the body of the text and see what you can think about there. Choose 3 or 4 of the 7 documents to source in your essay. I say 3 or 4 because 3 are required for you to earn the points. So you should always do a minimum of 3. The 4th would be your safety net. And the reason I say just 3 or 4 rather than trying to source all 7 documents is that inevitably, jumped ahead, one bullet too many. Sorry about that. Inevitably, one of the documents you're going to look at and be like, I don't know what the heck to do with this in terms of sourcing. As a teacher, when I'm assigning DBQs, I often will look at a particular document and go, I don't know how I would use this as a student. I can use the content of the document, but I don't know what to make of it sourcing wise. It would take me 15 minutes just to source this one document. That document isn't worth trying it on. So go for 4 out of the 7 instead of trying to source all 7. Use evidence from all 7 for your evidence point, but just do the sourcing on the ones that make the most sense. All right. Embed the sourcing in your analysis of the document, because remember that you're explaining the source component of each document in relation to your argument. So if you haven't downloaded the DBQ that I'm working from tonight, that link is in the chat. Please grab it because it's really going to help you. Before we jump into a sample, I'm just going to read for you the prompt that we're working from so that you can have a little bit of understanding of why I am or how I'm connecting my thoughts about this document to the particular prompt. I'm going to drop it in the chat as well, and then I'll read it out loud for you. It says, develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which cultural traditions or belief systems affected the attitudes toward merchants and trade in the period 1200 to 1600. So as I'm looking at these documents, I want to be thinking about belief systems or cultural traditions. I want to be thinking about trade and merchants and what the attitude is. I want to be thinking maybe about change over time. As I look at this prompt, I think of it as being a change over time prompt. It's not inherently a change over time prompt. You certainly could go comparative with it, but I like the idea of change over time for this because I wrote it, and that's what I was thinking of when I wrote it. So, so there you have it. That's how I'll be operating tonight. If you've got the document open, you can scroll down to document number 4. That's the one I'm going to be working from for tonight. And then we'll do document 5 together. I think it's 5 or 6 after this, but we'll start with document number 4. So first thing I want to read is the source line. And the source of this document is Ibn Khaldun. He's a leading Muslim scholar, and this is from his text, The Universal History, written in the 14th century. So that would be the 1300s. And he writes, "The manners of tradesmen are inferior to those of rulers, and far removed from manliness and uprightness. We have already stated that traders must buy and sell and seek profits. This necessitates flattery and evasiveness, litigation and disputation, all of which are characteristic of this profession. And these qualities lead to a decrease and weakening in virtue and manliness, for these acts inevitably affect the soul. As for trade, although it be a natural means of livelihood, yet most of the methods it employs are tricks, aimed at making a profit by securing the difference between the buying and selling prices, and by appropriating the surplus. This is why religious law allows the use of such methods, which, although they come under the heading of gambling, yet do not constitute the taking without return of other people's goods." So before I get into sourcing, right, I first want to kind of notice what this document seems to be suggesting about trade. Ibn Khaldun seems to have a somewhat mixed view of trade because he's really negative about the moral uprightness and character of merchants and tradesmen in the first paragraph. But in the second paragraph, he tempers that language a little bit. He acknowledges that trading is a natural means of livelihood, and he acknowledges that religious law allows trade to continue even though he feels as though it's gambling. So if this guy's got a really mixed view of trade, I want to be thinking about what I know about him or his situation that might impact why he has such a mixed view. And the first thing that I observe in this particular document is that he's a Muslim scholar. So this tells me a couple of things. He's an educated guy, but specifically, he's going to be educated in Islamic law. He's going to be educated in Islamic tradition. Muslim scholars, by and large, also tend to be fairly conservative and fairly orthodox in their practice of Islam. So those things that I can infer about Ibn Khaldun based on his status as a Muslim scholar, right, that would fall under the heading of point of view. So I know some things about his point of view. The significance of that to the text is, right, he, as a conservative Orthodox scholar, is going to place an emphasis on morality. He's also more likely to oppose trade because he's someone who doesn't specifically gain from trade, right? He's not a merchant. He's not the one who's benefiting from these trade policies. But I also know from my study from Unit 1 and the introduction to Islam that I had from my class, right, that Muhammad was a merchant. So Islam as a religion doesn't oppose trade or being a merchant. And so Ibn Khaldun, as a conservative Orthodox Muslim, despite how he personally might feel about merchants, can't wholly oppose trade as a practice because he knows that his faith allows for it. And he, perhaps grudgingly, but he does accept that idea. So just really quickly, a pop-up, boink, couple things on here where you can see where I'm connecting his status as a scholar with specific ideas from the text. If I were going to write this sourcing idea in the text or in my essay, I would probably want to do it maybe in a paragraph about Muslim views on trade, let's just say. And if I was saying that Muslim views on trade changed over time as Muslims spread and encountered trade in different areas of the world. Maybe that's my topic sentence in my paragraph. And if I wanted to use Ibn Khaldun, I could say, Ibn Khaldun represents, in the 13th century, a really mixed view of trade because as a as a Muslim scholar educated in Muslim tradition, he acknowledges the danger of trade to the souls of those involved in it. But his orthodox background also means that he can't fully abandon trade and oppose it entirely, because he comes from a tradition of merchants, including the Prophet Muhammad himself. So as I'm analyzing the text of the document and relating it to this idea of change, and the change will make more sense when we look at the next document, I'm embedding my point of view into the analysis that I'm writing. That would be one way to approach this document. I want to acknowledge, though, for any given document, there's more than one valid way to do sourcing. So I attempted a second one. I don't like it as much. If I were going to write this, I would write about point of view, because it's the sourcing for this document that I understand the best. So the second thing, though, that I notice in the source line itself is the historical situation. This is a document from the 14th century, from the 1300s specifically. And as I think about why that might be significant, there's nothing directly in the text that tells me about the historical situation or tells me why that historical situation might be relevant. So the historical situation may be more relevant to an overall argument. When I talk about complexity, that'll make a little bit more sense. But if I wanted to make some inferences, I could think about the fact that I know that in the 1300s, there is an expansion or intensification of trade networks throughout Afro-Eurasia, and that it is bringing a lot of non-Muslims into Muslim lands. And I might raise the question of whether a suspicion of foreigners is leading to a suspicion of traders, that perhaps Ibn Khaldun and others like him are concerned about merchants as much as anything, because they're concerned about the dilution of the purity of Islam with these foreigners or non-Muslims coming and participating in trade in Muslim lands. It's not directly related to the text. It's more just something I know about the time period and a question that I might raise. I think it's a weaker example of sourcing, but I did want to demonstrate, right, that for any document, we could look at more than one idea. So I would love to do a second document with you. The chat has been really quiet, so if you want to jump in and talk through this one with me, I would love that. Those of you out there in the chat, if you're just wanting to sit back and listen, I'll kind of narrate through this one, and then I'll talk a little bit about complexity, because I think if you're wanting to sit back and listen, I want to give you as much information as I can tonight. Okay, let me grab a quick drink of water so that my voice holds out for the next 30 minutes. And we'll look at document 6. This source is an Islamic court decision from Ankara, which is in modern-day Turkey, from the 17th century to the 1600s, but it is representative of generally Turkish guild practices in the 15th and 16th centuries, so the 14 and 1500s. That's helpful for us to notice right away before we even read the text of the document, right? We can acknowledge that this document is from a later time period than our prompt is asking about, but we are given the information that this is representative of practices and viewpoints common in the 14 and 1500s, which are right within the range of our prompt. Okay, so here's what this document says. It says the content of this document is that Mehmed and Hasi Mehmed and others from the Weavers Guild summoned to court Sakauglu Nasa, I should have practiced those names, from the said guild, so from the Weavers Guild, and said in complaint, whenever cotton yarn comes to town, the aforementioned, so Neush, arrives, pays an extra price, and takes it from its owner, and the other weavers may remain deprived of cotton yarn. As of old, when cotton yarn came, we all bought it together. The aforementioned has now acted contrary to the old custom. We do not agree to this. The aforementioned was warned emphatically that when cotton yarn comes once more, he should not buy it alone, but rather that it should be distributed among all. Whereupon the aforementioned took it upon himself to behave in the manner said. All right. So in terms of sourcing, things that we might notice, I would want to acknowledge that this is taking place in Turkey, that we're thinking about Ankara and its location, but also it's telling us Turkish guild practices, 15th and 16th centuries. So we're in Ottoman-controlled Turkey. So this is an Islamic court decision, but it's coming from a part of the Islamic world where like these are major centers of trade and exchange and commerce. This is happening in a large city. So like geographical context. So historical situation, I think, is actually a really important one for this particular document, thinking about the time of its creation, the time that it represents, the time and place in which it was created. And because of that, because of its historical situation as a document from a time and place where a lot of trade is happening, we can see how the focus of trade is no longer about the like ungodliness or unspiritualness of trade as a practice, but rather about morality in terms of fairness and following common practice. And I think because we're in a place where trade is so important, takes us a long way to understanding why the view on trade may have shifted over time. Because as cities grew and as trade became more common in some parts of the Islamic world, we would see attitudes toward trade changing to match that. So that's another example of sourcing to go along with this document. All right, so if you've got questions about sourcing, drop them in the chat. I'm going to move on to talk about complexity, just so that I'm honoring our time together. But I do want to answer questions if people have them. So the second point when we're talking about analysis and reasoning is complexity. And I mentioned it's the unicorn point, and Eric mentioned that it's like 600 and 700 essays. But if you want to strive for this idea of complex understanding, let's break down what it actually means. So the College Board rubric language says that complexity, that point, can be earned if an essay demonstrates a complex understanding of the historical development that is the focus of the prompt, using evidence to corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument that addresses the question. This can be done a lot of different ways. The key to complexity is that it has to be throughout the essay. No single sentence, no single paragraph is enough to earn this point. You cannot write a complexity paragraph and slap it on the end of your essay and earn this point. It has to be something that develops starting right from your thesis. So there's actually 3 words in this College Board rubric point that I want to break down for you. And then I want to walk you through how I would go about building complexity in a particular essay. So our 3 terms are corroborate. Corroborate is a word which means to confirm or support. So to corroborate is to bring ideas together and show how one idea supports or confirms or builds upon another idea. And ideally, all of our evidence is supporting your thesis. So I'm going to make the argument that if you have a complex thesis to begin with, building corroborating evidence will show complexity. We can think of corroboration as a yes and idea. This and this other thing, both together supporting this idea. The second term the College Board is throwing out at us is this idea of qualifying. Qualifying an argument is not undoing your argument. It's not undermining your argument with a counter argument, but it's limiting or countering slightly your argument in order to show another perspective or another viewpoint. I think of this as the yeah, but. Well, yeah, that's true, but also this other thing is true. And maybe they exist in tension with each other. So qualifying your argument, acknowledging other viewpoints, acknowledging other factors, acknowledging the fact that this might be true in this situation, but not universally, because in this situation, something else is more relevant or more prominent. And then modify. Modify just means to change the argument. So you might start with an argument and then modify it slightly to temper it or change it a little bit based on additional evidence that you have uncovered in the documents or remembered from your own learning. So those are like the three big categories of complexity. The key is like, how do I do this in an actual essay? So tips for complexity. The first is to start with a complex thesis. A complex thesis is a thesis that includes both a claim and a counterclaim. And if you've got a complex thesis and all of your body paragraphs support some element of your thesis, it goes a long way toward building a complex argument, developing it over the course of your essay. So like the most basic sentence frame that I could give you for your complex thesis starts with the word although. Although blank is true because of some kind of factor, something else is also true as well. So if we are looking at the prompt in the DBQ that we're working from tonight, develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which cultural traditions or belief systems affected the attitudes toward merchants and trade in the period 1200 to 1600. Although many belief systems and religions were suspicious of merchants because they gained their wealth by taking advantage of others, it is also true that in many cases, religions softened their stance on trade as well as trade became a more important point of connection and prosperity in different civilizations. That's a complex thesis statement. It's kind of rambly. When I'm writing out loud, my sentences tend to be a little more rambly. You could probably write something a lot more concise and beautiful on paper if you were doing this. But that's a complex thesis. And if I were going to develop that thesis, I would be able to pull together evidence from a lot of different sources. I would be able to use my sourcing analysis to highlight some of that evidence, and I would build this overall complex argument. The second thing was we're thinking about complexity, and this is a phrase that a lot of College Board consultants use when teaching teachers, because I've heard it from a couple of different consultants, is the idea of letting the documents talk to each other. In ye olde days, when the AP World History was first out there was a requirement on the DBQ to group documents together in some relevant category. There's no point anymore for grouping, and grouping isn't really what we mean. But if we think of the documents being in connection to each other, they may not actually be, document 2 might not literally be a response to document 1, although occasionally that happens. The documents relate to each other in different ways. And if we can think about those relationships, that can be a way to develop complexity. A key to this is to be sure that you show your work. Right? The keyword in the rubric for complexity is to explain. And if you can explain how documents relate to each other and why they're connected, why document 4 corroborates document 2, and how document 6 qualifies the argument from document 4, right? All of that, explaining that as you're developing your overall essay is part of what we mean by building a complex argument. You want to make any and all connections explicit. So let me show you a couple of examples from the DBQ that we're working with. So again, if you can pull up the DBQ from the link that I dropped in the chat, this is really going to help you. Document 3 in the DBQ, which we didn't look at earlier for sourcing, but it's a document from a Christian perspective. Document 3 is from Thomas Aquinas. He's a leading scholastic theologian. He's a Christian theologian writing in 1273. And Thomas Aquinas has a somewhat mixed view of trade. He talks about it being sinful in order to sell a thing for more than its just price. But then he tempers that and says, it's unlawful to sell something for too much or to undercut somebody and buy it for less than it's worth. However, if you suffer a loss economically in order to produce a particular product, you can make up for that as you develop the prices for your objects. So he's got a somewhat mixed view of trade. Later in the DBQ, document 5 is also from a Christian perspective. It's a series of letters to and from Italian merchants in the 14th century, so in the 1300s. So it's not very far apart in terms of timing. But what we see is that despite the fact that both of these documents are from Christian Europe, we go from a mixed view of trade to a very positive view of trade. These Italian merchants who are buying and selling religious paintings even, right? They're like still straight up in the world of religion, but it's a very positive view of trade and of merchants. And in a paragraph, we would want to think about why did that change occur over time? Why between 1273 and sometime in the 14th century, so it could be just as little as like 20 years later, why is there such a difference in the way that these folks are talking about trade? And this could relate to sourcing. Maybe it's the issue of theologians' views versus actual merchants' views. Maybe the issue is that trade became more important as more trade flooded into Europe, and that Thomas Aquinas is published, but speaking really, looking backwards at trade rather than looking forward like the Italian merchants. But if we can make that analysis part of a paragraph that discusses those two documents with one another, that's a way of building complexity. Similarly, earlier in the DBQ, document number 2 has a Chinese perspective, and it's a very negative view of trade and of merchants. By document 7, it's another Chinese perspective much later in the time period with a more mixed view of trade. There are some negative pieces, but also some allowances for trade to happen. And again, why did this change occur over time? And we think about, well, what has happened in China over time between these two documents? We think about, the Mongols have come in and they've taken over China. And as then, even after the Mongols are pushed out, the Yuan dynasty declines and is replaced by the Ming dynasty, right? We've seen China kind of become this center of trade. We've seen the status of merchants being raised over time, and that this new Chinese government can't simply return things to the way that it was in the past. And so they have to acknowledge this increased status of merchants and the value of merchants and trade to their society as a whole, as cities have grown larger and more people are involved in commerce, because not everybody can grow and build and create all of the things that they need for their own lives. So traders are necessary, even if you're not going to engage in widespread long distance trade all the time. Again, talking about that change, acknowledging those documents in relation to each other, showing that work in your body paragraphs is what's going to help you develop complexity. So in addition to a complex thesis, documents that talk to each other, and showing your work, one of the other tips that I like to give in terms of building complexity is to do what I call both sides of the analytical task. So this means if you are writing a comparative essay, and this holds true for both the document-based question and the long essay question, if you're writing a comparative essay, you should, somewhere in the essay, acknowledge similarities and differences. Now, simply having similarities and differences doesn't guarantee you the complexity point, but if you have thoughtful analysis of similarities, thoughtful analysis of differences, and some connection, some place in your essay where you transition between the two and think about why similarities and differences can exist at the same time as each other, that's a great way to build complexity. If you're writing a continuity and change over time essay, it's baked right into the title of that essay to talk about continuity, things that stay the same over time, and change. Right? Acknowledging that there's not a time in history where 100% of things change. So what stays the same and why? And there's no time in history where things just stay the same for long periods. Things are constantly changing and evolving. And why is that happening? Why is category A staying the same while category B is transforming, giving the why behind both sides of an analysis can help you earn that complexity point. For causation, do causes and effects. Thinking about the background leading to a particular historical development and the effects that that historical development has on history later on. And again, explaining the why behind it. Those are like my big tips in terms of complexity. And I think the thing that I said this earlier, and I want to reiterate about complexity, is that you should strive for complexity. Striving for the complexity point is going to set you up well to earn most, if not all, of the other points in the essay, right? A complex thesis earns the thesis point. A complex analysis includes evidence, which allows you to earn the evidence points. Complex analysis connects evidence to an argument, which is another evidence point. Complex analysis requires you to bring, in the DBQ, requires you to bring together evidence from the documents and your outside knowledge, right? That's its own point. So striving for complexity is always going to be a great idea because it's only going to help you to earn additional points from elsewhere on the rubric. As you're striving for it, don't stress it. Don't let this be the thing you get so hung up on that makes it really difficult for you to be successful in writing a DBQ essay. I would rather, and I tell my students this, I would rather have you write a simple, straightforward essay with no complexity than to get so caught up in your head trying to make it complex that you don't finish what you set out to write on the page. If you can get that complex thesis and the complexity just doesn't show up in the body paragraphs, that's okay. You're still earning your thesis point. You're still setting yourself up for good evidence points and analysis, other analysis points. If you're doing the sourcing, that's going to support your complexity, and that's its own point. So strive for it, but don't stress it. And honestly, that's, I think, really good advice for the DBQ in general, is to strive to do your best on this gargantuan task, but don't stress about any one component. Especially right now, be gracious with yourself, be gentle with yourself as you're doing this. Many of you for the first time in the next month or two in your classes. This is a really hard thing. This is one of the hardest things we teach in our AP history classes. And we're going to start wherever we're going to start, whatever level you're at. The goal is always to improve. Just do a little bit better each time you practice until we get to the exams in May and you get the opportunity to show all of the growth, all of the development that you've practiced all year long in that final glorious document-based extravaganza on the AP exam. So that's my spiel about analysis and reasoning, about sourcing and complexity.